A very warm welcome to the new episode of Incan Insights. This is your host, Sumit Sarma Samir. This platform invites global thought leaders and also promotes Nepali changemakers of diverse fields. So please subscribe to the channel. This week, my guest is Dana R. Fisher. Dana is a dynamic speaker and author who writes about activism, democracy, and climate policy. She is the director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity and a professor in the School of International Service at American University. She is also a non-resident senior fellow with the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution and the chair of the Political Sociology Section of the American Sociological Association. Her most recent book is Saving Ourselves: From Climate Shocks to Climate Action. She recently published in 2024 by Columbia University Press. She has published 7 books and more than 80 chapters and peer-reviewed articles, including in Nature, Science Advances, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Fisher served as the contributing author for Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Review, writing about citizen engagement and civic activism. Her media appearances include ABC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and various programs on NPR, BBC, and CBC. Her words have appeared in the popular media, including The Washington Post, Slate, Time Magazine, Politico, The Nation, Teen Vogue, The Hill, and The American Prospect. Dana, welcome to the Incan Insights with Sumit Sharma Samir.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Dana, at the outset, I just wanted to say that, we are deeply saddened by the loss of human lives and casualties in the United States because of recent wildfires. And I just wanted to ask on these issues, what do these events tell us about the urgency of climate action and our preparedness to deal with such disasters?
That's a great question to begin. So what's really interesting in the United States is that historically we have not experienced the effects of climate change as much as many more developing countries that tend to be the front line in the climate crisis, just because of our geographic location. And this year, we have started to see climate shocks hitting the United States consistently. And as the natural science predicts, and as the IPCC said, these shocks are coming, they're hitting with more severity and they're coming more frequently. So we had some extreme hurricanes that hit the United States in the fall, including Hurricane Milton, that had such a large effect that it actually devastated mountain communities in areas in Appalachia, including North Carolina, and there were lives lost and people who actually reported that they had moved into that area because they thought of it as a climate safe zone, and ended up realizing that they were not safe. Now we see these wildfires in the LA area. They're continuing to rage on. In fact, I heard on the radio this morning that there's a threat that they may expand again. They're trying to contain them. They're not yet contained. And they came out of the natural areas where we frequently see wildfires in California and on the West Coast into very urban areas, right? And destroyed communities. So the lesson, I think, for the United States is that climate change is not happening in other places. It's not a possibility. It is a reality that we are all facing. And what's ironic is that message, while it is starting to resonate with the population of the United States, we are about to shift on Monday to a government that is very much some of the members of the new Trump administration, which will be the second Trump administration, are explicitly what we would consider climate denialists. They believe that climate change is not happening. They do not respect or believe the science, which is, quite extensive at this point. So there's no question about the way that climate change is happening. The science is very, very well verified. And we have the United Nations making very clear statements about this. The Secretary General has spoken many times in recent months about it. And yet we now have an administration that will implement policies based on alternative facts, which is what they would say, which basically means they won't follow the science and will make decisions that will, with no question, lead to more lives lost and more property lost. And, one of the challenges here is that it's not, there will be huge economic costs for this. We're already seeing it in the United States. That will have an effect on the insurance industry, but also on individual people who live in many areas of the United States, not just areas that are being hit by the wildfires.
Yeah, yeah. And it's so sad that, these kind of events initially shape public perception and discourse around climate change. I mean, we also had devastating earthquake in 2015, and then the preparedness around it was rather sluggish at latter point of time. But do you see these events motivating stronger grassroots movements?
Well, I can tell you from the research that we have so far, and I would just say that an earthquake is different because it's not a climate shock, right? So, but what we do know, there has been some really good research that's come out in the past year that documents the ways that people who have personally experienced climate shocks change their attitudes. And one of the important things in the United States is we have a very politically polarized populace right now. And there are lots of reasons for that we can get into if you're interested. But even across political ideology, what the research has shown and documented really effectively is that when people experience climate shocks firsthand, it changes their attitudes about climate action. And in some cases, it actually motivates them to get involved personally. So, and that is effective across political ideologies. So no matter where you are on the conservative liberal spectrum, no matter whom you vote for, that is the case. So the research has been really wonderful on that. We need to have more research to directly connect that with specific types of activism, but we do know that people who have personally experienced climate shocks are much more likely to engage in a whole bunch of collective action. And the collective action runs from protesting in the streets. I have documented that in my research, but also to contacting elected officials and doing more insider political behavior that we talk about within the civic engagement literature. So we know this. We will be able to document it even more. In fact, my team is about to start looking at people who have experienced climate shocks recently. The literature, as you know, it takes a while for the research to come out. So the recent studies are not on the current or the climate shocks that people are just starting to recover from. They're from climate shocks that happened in the past.
Right. And can you please take us through your recent publication, Saving Ourselves? And what is this book all about?
So Saving Ourselves it's an interesting book in that it's a book that was written for a general audience. And in it, I bring together research that I have been conducting for the past 25 years. So I'm a political sociologist, as you mentioned, which means I study decision-making around climate, and I look at democratic practice, broadly defined. And over the course of my career, I have tracked climate policy making, looking at the different actors that can play a role in climate policy making. That would be the state, the economic sector, the market, and then civil society, citizens who work through organizations and individually to affect change. And I've written many articles about this over the years in different places. You mentioned some of them. And the reason I wrote Saving Ourselves is because as I've continued to do this research, there were some very clear trends. One of the trends that was most alarming is that I've tracked international policy making around climate change since the Kyoto Protocol was originally drafted in the 1990s. In 1997, that was when the Kyoto meeting happened for the UN climate regime, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I've tracked all the different decisions that have come since then, the different instruments that have been used. And what we see is that even though there are various efforts that have been made internationally that have led to domestic policy making, greenhouse gas concentrations continue to go up in the atmosphere. So we have not gotten where we need to go with regard to addressing climate change. At the same time, the climate crisis has gone from being something that we talk about as, a precautionary scientific, theory that looks likely to affect us, but for the moment was really expected only to affect the polar bears, right? And people who live in, extreme areas or areas with extreme temperatures, to being something that everybody is experiencing. And so during the period that I've been doing the research, I noticed this. So I realized what I needed to do was write something that was more a combination or an agglomeration of the research and talk about what the message is for the general public. And so Saving Ourselves takes us through what it will take really to save ourselves, starting from understanding why policymaking has been insufficient, why the state and the market are not going to save us. One of the things I do there is I talk about my research, but also build on some really wonderful research that scholars and colleagues of mine have done that talk about the role that fossil fuel interests have played in keeping us from implementing effective climate policies and leading us and blocking us from the type of systemic changes that are extremely well documented to be necessary to address the climate crisis. And then from there, I talk about the role that civil society plays, which is the other aspect of my research. I go back and forth between looking at policy elites and looking at civil society. And then in this book, I basically look at them together and I see the role that civil society has played, and then think about what is the most likely way to get us through the climate crisis. We can't stop the climate crisis at this point, but we can limit the effects. And while at this point, it is clear that lives will be lost, lives are already being lost. They're being lost in the United States, but they're being lost all around the world in more climate vulnerable spaces than we have in the United States, for sure. That's well documented. And so we need to start to address this crisis at the level that's necessary so that fewer lives will be lost and the climate crisis becomes limited. So what I talk about there is why civil society is the most likely social actor to push for the type of changes we need, the systemic changes. And then I talk about what we know about the climate movement and climate activism, the ways that activism has become more confrontational in recent years because activists around the world are very frustrated that we haven't done what we need to do to address the climate crisis, and people are experiencing the effects of the crisis. And then I end by talking about what we all need to do. And I have suggestions about how to get us where we need to be in terms of mobilizing people and creating resilient communities that can support one another as climate shocks hit, because we know they will. And that's it. That's the book in a nutshell. I do a better job summarizing it in my recent TED Talk, but there's my today version.
Okay.
Or you're welcome to share the link with your listeners if they want to see a more polished version of what the book's about.
Sure, I'll do that. And Dana, you must have come up with some of the recommendations on how to galvanize people on towards the action. Could you shed light on that? How do we do about that? How do you go on doing about that?
Well, so what we know right now is that public perception of climate change is quite high globally, and yet we still don't see substantial action from the civic sector around pushing for climate action. So what I ask in the book is I look at my research and I look at the other research that exists to think about what will it take to get us to act at the level we need. And that's where I talk about the role that climate shocks are going to play in climate action. So one of the things that I do in my research is I survey protesters. And so I have data in the book based on people who have been engaging in climate activism to understand who they are, what motivated them to get out in the streets. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how recent activism has really shown, or the people who have engaged in recent activism have been people who have personally experienced climate shocks, and they report that, and they tell, if you do, when I do interviews with them, they tell these stories about their personal experiences with climate shocks and their personal experiences that got them angry and ready to do something about climate change. And so based on that research, one of the things that I talk about in the book is how the path towards effective climate action runs through communities, and it runs through activists who are in some cases outraged by the loss, the damage, the experience of the climate crisis, which unfortunately is likely to have to hit people more personally, and not necessarily firsthand, but in our social networks where we know people who have experienced it. I mean, at this point, just we were talking in the beginning about what's happening out in California. This year is the first time in my life where I know multiple people who have lost homes to climate shocks. And I know people in both North Carolina who lost homes to the flooding there, but I also know people who recently lost homes out in California. And it is the fact that, the crisis is getting closer and closer to us, and that will mobilize people. And so that is one of the dynamics that I talk about quite extensively in the book.
तिमीसँग अब धेरै टाइम छैन है बिहे गर्नु छ भने गरिहाल नत्र घरबाट मलाई अन्त्य बिहे गर्दिनु
भर्खर 3 वर्ष भयो एमबीबीएस जोइन गरेको 5 वर्षको कोर्स हो के भो जम्मा छ एक्सक्यूज मी सर मेरो 5 वर्षको कोर्स 3 वर्षमा सकाउन मिल्दैन
गेट आउट
हेलो
के सोच्यौ त
के सोच्ने मैले प्रिन्सिपलसँग पनि कुरा गरिसके 3 वर्षमा पनि के हुन्छ 3 वर्षमा
के भयो भाइ ल बस साउजी एक कप चिया कसले भन्यो 3 वर्षमा के हुँदैन भनेर यो हेर एलआईसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजनामा 3 वर्षमा पैसा फिर्ता हुन्छ
ए हो र
जीवन बीमाको साथमा धनवृष्टि 3 वर्षमा एलआईसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजना एलआईसी नेपाल
Right. And I have also seen that you have been going around to many countries and talking about these issues. How do you see in terms of public perception towards the climate crisis in some of the other countries that you have gone and shared your experiences?
Well, I would just say, so I have spent, most of my time has been in Western Europe at this point. So I spent a bunch of time talking to people when I was on book tour. I did spend a little bit of time in Asia, but not as much as I wish I had. I just haven't had the opportunity. But I would just say that when I talk to people, I do talks around the work, and I end up talking to people who are interested in getting more involved. And one of the things that I found is, first of all, that many people have the same stories of, the shocks are different, right? So it's different if you look at how people, how climate change is affecting people in Nepal than people in, Singapore, than people in Wales. So it's different, but people are starting to have personal stories about what's happening. People are also starting to feel increasingly anxious about it. And that's one of the things that my research documents, is the ways that emotions are helping to get people more concerned about climate change. And in contrast to claims about how anxiety can paralyze people in terms of action, at least the people whom I've spoken to, one of the heartening things is looking at how the anxiety frequently leads to anger, which actually is a great motivator for action. But the other thing that I've noticed as I've gone to a number of countries is I speak to a lot of activists who come to my talks, and many of them, particularly across Europe, have experienced increasing repression in terms of their ability to engage in democratic practice of activism. So many activists across Western Europe, the UK has gotten a lot of attention for this, but across Switzerland, Germany, have come to my talks and told me about being arrested for blocking streets or standing in the street or being sprayed by hoses that, the police are spraying on them, or tear gassed because they're standing in the street trying to draw attention to the climate crisis. And this repression is an unfortunate turn that we're seeing across particularly advanced industrialized nations and democratic states. In developing countries, unfortunately, the repression is much more violent. And we know from research that's been documenting the ways that environmental defenders have been murdered and have been targeted in developing countries. But for my work, I've been focusing on so-called democratic states that are advanced democracies. And we're seeing a similar turn towards serious repression of activists. And so that in some way is slowing down, I think, the mobilization that we need to see to get us to the kinds of public pressure and mass mobilization that's necessary. Although, as I talk about in my book, that process actually can lead to an expansion of participation in the movement.
Mhm, mhm. And it's very interesting that you had been engaged and involved in this field, and you had been vocally talking about activism, democracy. And I was wondering, how do you see, the development of democracy itself over a period of, these many years that you are a parcel of, a research team or leading yourself? How do you assess the system?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I first, I mean, I think it's impossible for me to answer this question not to include like my personal positionality and the way that I have changed. I have gotten older. I have become a parent. I now have children who are teenagers who are becoming adults, and so it really changes my perspective on living in a democracy or a so-called democracy even. So I would say that on the one hand, I have become much more a student who believes that democracy is an ideal to be achieved and not something that we are currently experiencing. And even in these so-called the countries that are known for being the most democratic states, there still are a lot of ways that people are not free and do not have the types of freedoms that, as I say, I call myself a student, students of democratic practice, we study about. And I mean, what's really interesting is that in my career studying activism, I have surveyed protesters, activists at countless protests in multiple countries. So, but I always I always control for states that identify themselves as democratic, advanced, industrialized nations, because there are very big differences when countries don't call themselves democracies, right? And if they're in different levels of development. So when I've collected data in these multiple locations, I have seen the way that there is less freedom and there is more repression. I mean, I went through a period of time of studying responses to climate activism by the climate regime. And I used to go to the climate negotiations and participate in the negotiations as an NGO observer, as a scholar observer, but also study the way that civil society was participating. And many years ago, I wrote a paper with a number of colleagues where we documented how the climate regime was one of the most democratic and transparent of the international regimes. Unfortunately, since that time, the regime has really become much less open and permeable and democratic. And so at a certain point after Paris, I realized that participating in the negotiations where I was only given very limited access, and now really I probably wouldn't be given access at all to participate, was a complete waste of carbon. So unless this was an opportunity where I could attend and really participate, there's just no reason to be involved anymore. And one of the anecdotes I mentioned to colleagues who are talking about going is I say, if I were to go, I probably would end up participating in and speaking on panels with people who work here in Washington, D.C. And the idea that I would fly around the world to go sit on a panel and talk to people who I can take, the metro to see is just, it seems like a big waste and a terrible thing to do with my carbon budget, my personal carbon budget. So I would just say that we see a regime that's become less permeable. And I think that part of the reason for that, and some of the things that I talk about in the book, is the way that fossil fuel interests have been empowered and given privileged access to power and resources more and more so as they become, or they've seen themselves as becoming more vulnerable to target, because everybody recognizes the role that they are playing in the climate crisis and the way that we can see a path forward through a clean energy transition. And as a result, we see much less opportunity. So at the international level, we see less opportunity for civil society to participate, but we also see it in nation states, even the states that are saying that they are the most democratic, which is really unfortunate. And that's a trend that I expect we're going to see continue over the next few years. I mean, we're certainly going to see that in my country, but I fear that we'll see that across Western Europe as well.
Right. If you could give one message to policymakers, corporations, and individuals about the urgency of climate action, what would it be?
I would say that the climate action is inevitable. The question is, how late in the game will they finally agree to take the necessary action and make the systemic changes needed? And what will be determined by that is, one, how many lives will be lost within the nation states where these, politicians lead, and two, the degree to which they'll be able to maintain power. Because what I talk about in Saving Ourselves is that climate change isn't stopping. And it is very clear. I mean, scientists, the natural scientists, have been screaming at the top of their lungs about what's coming. It's very clear the types of cascading effects that we are likely to see. And we're likely to see them, in our lifetimes in the next decade or so. We're already starting to see some of that. And as a result of that, the social systems, those are the folks that I study as a social scientist, will respond. And they are going to respond with urgency and anger. And so if a policymaker wants to maintain legitimacy and maintain power, they will have to be proactive before they are forced to make the changes that are needed. And before they potentially lose capital, lose resources, lose members of their population. And, and those things, when countries lose those things, when that happens, people in power lose power and they no longer run those countries. So that's the path forward. There is no other path. Right now, we see a lot of countries that are leaning into denial, and you can deny the urgency to a point, but we're almost to the point where you can't deny it anymore, and action will be necessary and inevitable.
Right. I somehow feel that at least one of the positive thing that has happened in last 25, 30 years is that people from all walks of life, from different countries, there's a space to get connected via technology and to get the message across. I mean, this is not a particular issue for any particular country or not, within the nation state. It affects the entire humanity, right? So perhaps some of the that kind of people coming together could also help to sort of amplify the issues around climate actions. What's your thought on this?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, at the same time, I think there are opportunities and challenges because of the digital world in which we live. I mean, for example, it's wonderful to be able to meet you and to be able to communicate with scholars and colleagues around the world and to share ideas and information. I mean, I am able to collaborate with scholars without having to get on an airplane, and I don't have to write a letter. Sending letters. I mean, I came of age right as letters were becoming obsolete, thank goodness, because I was terrible at writing letters. But I mean, the idea that to share information and ideas involves writing letters and waiting for them to get to destinations. I mean, I'm thankful that we don't live in that world anymore. However, there are challenges to the digital world. I mean, and we're seeing that in the threats of AI in terms of the type of energy consumption that they are driving. And, there has been a lot of conversation here in the United States about the ways that a lot of the big tech companies are having to build out and expand their, the resource consumption so that they can just fuel AI and fuel the technology. So there's a real challenge there. At the same time, on the civic side, I teach at American University, and I teach a class on activism to graduate students, and it's really interesting how frequently I see students who come into class who believe that activism involves, just getting on their phone. And I can tell you from the research I've been doing, and I started studying digital technology back in the 1990s, so I've been tracking how that is affecting particularly civic participation and activism since then as well. And one of the things that is very clear, and I have written about in 3 different books, including Saving Ourselves, is that we cannot save the world and we cannot do the work that we need to do without actually really connecting to our community. And that means you need to get offline and make connections where you live, work, and experience climate shocks. And one of the things that that people I know in California keep talking about is that, one of the first things that happens when wildfire comes, when flood comes, when disaster hits, you lose electricity. You lose your, cell towers go down, and no longer do you have digital connections to the outside world. It's not like you can go on TikTok. This is what I tell my students. You can't go on TikTok and ask for help and expect people to come. But you can knock on the doors. I'm just looking at my window at my neighbor's house. Like, you can go knock on the doors of the people who live near you if you need something, and they can help you. And they'll be much more likely to help you if you know them and you work with them and you communicate with them and you have these dense ties and strong ties to your neighbors. So I think that we cannot replace connections, social connections online, but I think that it can be an added layer. And I think that that's wonderful. But we do need to think about how we're going to deal with the amount of energy consumption that that this type of technology requires, because it's a real problem.
Right. So in that context, how do you think that sociology helps, a sociological framework helps to understand the climate action?
Well, in terms of activism, it is absolutely necessary that we understand who's participating, what they're doing, what's motivating them, and also more broadly to understand political processes, what works and what doesn't. And so that's what my research is all about. So I take research teams out into crowds and we survey protesters to understand who they are, why they're there, what they're doing, what they have done. And then we track them to see what they do. And that kind of data is absolutely necessary to understand social movements. And so that's what I do. And I've done it around climate activism. I've done it about all sorts of activism. My last book, which was called American Resistance, followed the coalition of activists and social movements that worked together to push back against the Trump administration and its policies during the first Trump administration, starting in 2017. And I believe that having the data that my team collected and that our analysis provided helped us understand a lot more about the ways that, America was responding to the Trump administration. And it helped us understand what came next and understand how Biden came into office. Unfortunately, the data also talks about and shows why we are back at Trump again. So, but we need to have that research and scholarship. And so that's where I am in this world. I'm not an activist.
Right. On that note, Dana, thank you so much for your time. It was indeed great pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for having me.